Greetings class and welcome to Accounting 202. This is a review video for multiple choice type questions for exam number 1. In this review video I'm going to go through a series of multiple choice type questions that you can expect to see something similar to this on the exam. Now the exam will cover the first 3 chapters, and the multiple choice type questions will be very similar to what you see here. In this first exam, there will be a lot of definitional and conceptual type questions, but there will also be questions where you calculate something or you have to identify a journal entry or something like that. So I'm going to go through these here with you. We have some questions here. Now let me just say on the exam itself, you can expect about 25 questions. 3 to 5 of those questions will be open-ended, where you'll do a calculation to answer the question. The remainder will be objective like this, where you have multiple choice or true and false. So number 1 here says manufacturing overhead includes what? All manufacturing costs except direct labor. Well, that's not correct. You can eliminate that right away. All selling and admin. Well, selling and admin is not overhead. It's period cost. And then it's letter D is all direct material, direct labor, and administrative costs. Those just don't go together. You're going to have direct material, direct labor, and overhead, but those are not going to be a part of overhead. This answer is letter C. A good way to remember overhead is that it's all manufacturing costs except direct labor and direct materials. Okay, the second one here, direct costs. Basically, when you're talking about direct costs, you're talking about direct costs like direct materials and direct labor. And remember, these, we're doing a job order cost system where these are traced directly to the product. So letter B is the answer for this one. So direct costs can easily be traced to a particular cost object. For number 3 here, we have a factory supervisor's wages are classified as, and we have 2 possible classifications: indirect labor and fixed overhead, fixed manufacturing overhead. And so you need to know what where a factory supervisor's wages would fit. In this case, they're not direct labor, because they're not working directly on the product. They're supervising those who are. So they definitely are going to be indirect labor. But also, these costs can be a part of fixed manufacturing overhead. So the answer here is letter B. Now, this is a good type of question for the exam. And by the way, here's where they have a choice B. Because B is going to say, yes, those costs are both indirect labor and overhead. Now, you will see, or it's a good chance you will see something like this on the exam, where you have to identify where a cost would fit or where it would be classified. Product costs that have become expenses can be found in and this one is really identifying the costs that product costs that have become expenses. This is really identifying where those costs are going. Okay, so when we have product costs and we're accumulating those, once they are recorded and become expenses, they go into actually the cost of goods sold account. So these product costs become expenses when we move them from inventory into the cost of goods sold. So they'd be going from finished goods into inventory, or into cost of goods sold. So we have finished goods, and that cost would then go to cost of goods sold when we sell the product. That's when these become costs, all right, or expenses. Number 5, which of the following costs is classified as both a prime and a conversion cost? Well, prime costs are going to be direct labor and direct material. So we have two costs there. Conversion costs are going to be direct labor and manufacturing overhead. So the one that's the same in both of these cases is going to be direct labor. Direct labor is going to be both a prime cost and a conversion cost. You just need to, and for an answer like this or a question like this, you just need to know what prime costs are and what conversion costs are. And number 6 asks, what is prime cost? Well, I've already described that to you. Prime costs are going to be both direct material and direct labor. So prime costs are all of the basically direct costs that you can identify with a product. Number 7 asks, which is the correct formula to compute predetermined overhead rate? Well, they give you several here. They have predetermined overhead rate as estimated total overhead costs. Well, that part's right. Divided by actual units. Now, the thing that makes this incorrect is actual. We're not going to divide by actual units. That's incorrect. Predetermined overhead rate is equal to estimated total units divided by estimated total cost. This is backwards. We don't want to do that, so that's not correct. We're not going to divide units by costs. Predetermined overhead rate is equal to actual total manufacturing costs. Again, this is incorrect because we're looking at estimated total manufacturing costs. The answer here is going to be letter D, because predetermined overhead rate is going to equal the estimated total manufacturing cost divided by the estimated total units in the allocation base. Okay. Number 8, Purvis Corporation is using a predetermined overhead rate that was based on estimated total fixed overhead of 121,000 and 10,000 direct labor hours for the period. The company incurred actual costs of 113,000 and 10,009 total direct labor hours during the period. The predetermined overhead rate is closest to. Now let me just say, in this problem they give you more information than you need. We're not interested in actual. Remember, if we're doing predetermined overhead rates, we're looking at the estimated. So in this case, the rate is going to be 121,000 divided by 10,000 direct labor hours. So the rate is going to be $12.10 per direct labor hour. So when we're looking at this, the answer is going to be letter D. The thing to remember is when we're doing predetermined overhead rates, we're looking at estimated, not actual. So this is unnecessary information. Which of the following, number 9, which of the following statements is not correct? This is important, not correct concerning multiple overhead rate systems. Well, letter A, a multiple overhead rate system is usually more accurate. That is correct. We mentioned that when we were going through the material in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. A multiple overhead rate system is more accurate. So that one can't be the answer because we're looking for the one that is not correct. Letter B, a company may choose to create a separate overhead rate for each of its production departments. This is also correct because we can do that, and we do. So mark that off. Letter D, a multiple overhead rate system is more complex than a system based on a single plant-wide overhead rate. We've said that is correct too. It is more complex. So those are correct. Therefore, letter C must be the answer here. It says here, in departments that are relatively labor intensive, their overall cost should be applied to jobs based on machine hours. That's not correct. When we were talking about this topic, if they're labor intensive, they're going to use direct labor hours. So this is the incorrect item in that question. Okay. All right, let's move down to the next one, number 10. It says Johansson Corporation uses a predetermined overhead rate based on direct labor hours to apply manufacturing overhead to jobs. The corporation has provided the following estimated cost for the next year. Jameson, it's actually Johansson, I guess that's a typo, estimates that 20,000 direct labor hours will be worked during the year. The predetermined overhead rate per hour will be. Now this is different from the last one because they give us a list of items that are expenses, and we have to decide what goes into overhead. So the first thing that goes into overhead here, we're not going to have direct materials or direct labor in overhead, but we are going to have the rent on the factory building. Okay. Sales salaries are not going in either because these are period costs. We're not going to put those in manufacturing costs. Depreciation costs will be included because they're part of manufacturing costs. Indirect labor will also be included because they're part of manufacturing, and also production supervisor salary. So what we're going to have here is $15,000 in the rent on the factory building, $8,000 in depreciation. We're going to have indirect labor of $12,000 and production supervisor salary of $15,000. Our total that we're going to have for overhead or estimated overhead costs will be $50,000. Okay, so these are the total estimated costs. So we add all these up and we get $50,000. So then what we're going to do is divide that cost by the direct labor hours. So we have the estimated direct labor hours of 20,000. That means the rate here, the overhead rate, will be $2.50 per direct labor hour. And the answer here will be letter B. Okay, these are really good questions for multiple choice where you have a calculation that's needed. All right, for number 11, we have a question. In a job order costing system, indirect labor cost is usually recorded as a debit too. Now, remember what we're talking about, indirect labor cost. Indirect labor cost is not going to go into work in process directly. It'll go into manufacturing overhead first. So the answer here is the letter C. Any indirect cost is automatically classified in overhead, and then it gets applied using the predetermined overhead rate. Okay, number 12. The journal entry to record applying overhead during the production process is what? Well, we're not going to put overhead directly into finished goods ever, so that's out. Also, we're never going to transfer costs from work in process to overhead, so that's also out. And finally, we're never going to transfer cost out of finished goods and into overhead either, so that's out. The one that is correct here is when we debit work in process and credit manufacturing overhead. That entry represents applied overhead, which is what we're doing when we do this entry. It means we're calculating the amount of overhead based on the predetermined overhead rate and moving that out of overhead and into work in process. Okay, number 13, it says refer to the T account below, and it gives us a list of transactions here. And it says the ending balance of 8,000 represents which of the following. So what we've got here is in manufacturing overhead, a series of costs where we've debited the cost directly to overhead. These are costs we've paid for, and we've identified the belonging in overhead. We have a total cost of $159,000. Under this entry, where we're going to credit overhead, this is going to be applied overhead that we're moving out of overhead and into work in process. So applied overhead means that we're using the overhead rate to reduce overhead and increase work in process. So what we have is we have a debit amount here and a credit amount here, and we have a credit balance here. Whenever we have a credit balance in overhead, we're going to have over-applied overhead. This means we put too much overhead in work in process, more than what we actually incur in cost. So for this one, for number 13, the answer is going to be letter D, over-applied overhead. Okay. Number 14, under a job order costing system, the dollar amount transferred from work in process to finished goods is the sum of the cost charged to all jobs, okay, to finished goods, from work in process to finished goods, to all jobs that are completed during the period. We haven't sold them yet. We're putting them in finished goods. They're ready to be sold. But when we're moving them from work in process to finished goods, we're merely saying, okay, those are done in the production process and they're ready to be sold. So it's letter B, all right? Number 15, in the schedule of cost of goods manufactured and cost of goods sold, the total raw materials available is computed by adding together the beginning raw materials inventory and, this is going to be letter D, purchases of raw materials. So we have beginning raw materials, which is what we're talking about here. And we're going to add purchases of raw materials. And the total of those two is raw materials available. So total raw materials available. And the next step that we would normally see here is to subtract out ending raw materials to get raw materials used in production. So what you're looking for, or what we're looking for in this question, is how do we calculate the raw materials available? Well, it's simply going to be beginning raw materials plus purchase raw materials equals total raw materials available. So that's the answer. Now these are 15 questions, so obviously the actual test will have a few more multiple choice questions on it, but I present these to you as good examples of types of questions you can expect to see. Also, like I said, there will be several definition and concept type questions, but there will be some multiple choice questions like we had back up here, where we're computing an overhead rate, or we are looking at a journal entry like here to decide, okay, which of these journal entries is the right one for applying overhead, and then back up here, how do we actually calculate the plant-wide or predetermined overhead rate, POHR. All right, so these are some example questions. This is for you to use as a study tool. If you have any questions about these, feel free to reach out and let me know. There is also a video here for open-ended questions or problems. So in this video, you'll review the multiple choice, and then there's another video to review the problems. I hope this helps. Have a great day and a great week.